Let's talk about cout. Now, what is cout? It is C++'s normal means of outputting to the console. And if you look up pretty much anything in C++ for console applications, you're going to find cout. And then when you come to Qt, you find that cout is, well, missing. Then nobody uses it. And there's a reason for that. But what I really want to drive home in this video is that it's not C++ or Qt. You can mix and match them at will. There's really no restrictions. So let's just dive in and take a look here. So I'm going to say include, and we need to include IOStream. That's part of the C++ standard library, and IOStream is, well, a stream of information, hence input-output stream, IOStream. Now we're going to include Qdebug. What's the difference between these two? Well, IOStream is part of C++ standard library, where Qdebug is part of Qt. You can tell it's part of Qt because it starts with the letter Q. Notice Qcore, Qdebug, pretty much anything that starts with Q while you're using Qt is part of Qt, not part of the standard library. All right, now that we have those two, let's go ahead and use a namespace. Say using namespace. And namespace really gets into the concept of scope, something we're going to really dive into later on. But really what we're doing is we're saying we're going to use the standard library, and I don't want to have to type std before I use it. I just want it to be automatically used. So we're going to use that namespace. So under the hood, when I type something, for example, if I go down here and I type cout, in the background, C++ is automatically adding that in there. It's saying standard library, and then it's got the scope of cout. So we're saying standard library, use cout. But we don't need that because we're doing the using namespace. And for all you C++ gurus out there, yes, I'm very much abbreviating that just so people that are very new to this can understand it very quickly rather than having a 3-hour conversation about namespaces and scope. All right, so cout, now the whole point of cout is, well, to print to the output stream. I'm going to say hello, and then L. L is a bit controversial. Some people love it, some people hate it. A lot of people say don't use it. I've actually read a couple pretty good articles that said L is dead, don't ever use that. But we're going to use it just for the sake of demonstration here. Now, in case you're wondering, L is treated slightly differently depending on where you use it. In the background, what's really happening is something like this. They're printing a special character, and then other systems will do something like /0 or r/n/0, something like this, and all sorts of mix, match, and combinations. Now, over time, it's become pretty much standardized that that is just an end line or end L. But understand that every operating system is slightly different. And so, for example, Windows versus Mac or Linux, the end of line for a Windows machine would be a carriage return line feed, or a Linux box or a Mac box would just be a /n. Notice there's 2 characters versus 1. This right here is just an escape sequence. It's very much just a way of saying, hey, computer, take what I'm about to type and translate it into something else. All right, so anyways, we just saved a very lengthy conversation, but at the core, that's really what we're talking about here. So let's save and run. And it's just saying hello. And you notice how the cursor has now dropped down a line because that end L is saying, boop, we are done. We're at the end of the line, drop down. So that is the C++ way of doing things. Now let's say Qinfo. Now, in case you're wondering, Qinfo is available to us because we've included Qdebug. And there's a whole lot more in Qdebug than Qinfo, but we're just using it just as an example. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to do it the Qt way. So let's call this the C++ way and the Qt way. Notice how they are identical. They do the exact same thing, at least on the screen. Now, under the hood, there is a vast difference. Qt has a whole message handling system in the background that we can hook into. So anywhere in our application, if we use a Qinfo or a Qdebug or Qerror, critical or final, or any of the things that we're going to cover, we can hook into that and do something like log it to a file or send it to the system or whatever we want to do. Where with C++, it just immediately goes out to cout. So one of the common questions is, what is the difference between Qinfo and cout? Well, to be brutally honest, yes. At the very end of this whole chain, it does do a cout and prints it right out to the console, but there's a whole lot of cute goodness along the way. So you're going to see when you get away from C++ and you go into Qt, people really don't use this anymore. They use this because you can hook into that messaging system if you need to. Now let's wrap this up a bit. Let's say we want to do int age equals 44. Let's do a cout. And I just want to show that we can output different types of information. Don't really have to have a string. Now this right here will drive the old C++ programmers absolutely bonkers because it makes no sense. And let me explain. So what we're doing here is we're saying, make a variable called age, which is an int, give it a value of 44. Then we're going to output the age. Then we're going to output an inline. Then we're going to flush the stream. I'm putting this here just for demonstration that you'll see this kind of code out in the wild here if you're using C++. And really all we're doing is we're making 3 outputs. So for example, age, inline, and then flush. Flush here actually isn't an output, it's a command. And let's go ahead and demonstrate. Notice how it just says 44 and we got this end L. There's no like flush or special character or anything like that. So what flush is doing is telling IO stream, hey, we're done outputting. Let's say we put a bunch of information out there. Go ahead and push it down to the stream. So if you ever see flush, that's really what's going on here. Notice we don't need any of that for the Qt way. So that's why people tend to favor Qinfo, Qdebug, and things of that nature. Now that we know how to output to the console, what about input? How do we get the user's input? That's where cin comes in here. So cin is the C++ normal means of inputting from the console. We're going to, of course, mix and match Qt and the standard library just to show how simple it is. All right, first things first, we need to go ahead and do some includes here. So let's jump in here, okay. Include, and we want IO stream because we're going to work with input and output. And I want to output the Qt way, so I'm going to say Qdebug. And let's go ahead and say using namespace std. Some people will actually argue you don't need this or you shouldn't even use this because you're importing the entire namespace. And instead, because you're only using one thing, you should do something like this, where you say cin. What is the correct answer? Well, really depends on what you're trying to do and how you want to do it. There really is no correct answer. Everyone's going to have a different opinion. And I'm sure there's going to get some comments in the comment section of this video, but really understand what you're doing here is you're saying that entire namespace std is available for your application. All right, now most modern compilers are going to be smart enough to figure out what you're trying to do. So we're going to say int age. Now notice we're not initializing this variable. So I'm going to say, please enter an age. Now I want to actually stop the execution of this program until the user gives me a valid number here. Notice the directions of the arrows. If it's going to the left, we're outputting. If it's going to the right, we're inputting. So we're actually saying cin, take some information and put it into this variable. That's exactly what we're doing there. And then we're just going to output it. So really what we're doing is we're chaining here. We're saying Qinfo output a string you entered and then output that variable. Go ahead, save and run here. So let's go ahead and enter an age, and I'm going to say 24. You entered 24. See how that works? It's actually very simple. Let's go ahead and review super quick. So we've got Qt Core application, which is needed for our application to enter its event loop. We've got IO stream, which is part of the standard library, and Qdebug, which is part of Qt Core. We're going to use namespace std. So we're just using the standard library namespace. So it's an internal header included by other libraries. Do not attempt to use it directly. What does that mean? It means don't go in there and try to use the functions directly. A little bit more advanced than what we're talking about here. So we're making a variable called age. We are not initializing this. This is a little bit dangerous here. If we wanted to, we could do something like this just to make sure it's at a 0. And then we're going to output, please enter your age. And then we're going to input into that variable. And then we're going to output you entered and then the variable name. So let's play around with this a little bit. So we're just going to run it once and we're going to enter a valid age, 78. Now let's go ahead and rerun this and enter some invalid ages just to see what happens. I don't know what kind of age that would be, but I'm just assuming they would be very old. Notice how it's now cast or converted into an integer of 0. What that means is C++ is smart enough to know that this is not a valid number. There are other ways of doing this, and we're going to cover those later on, but I just wanted to throw that out there that there is a little bit of safety net there. You just really shouldn't trust it. Now, one of the main caveats here is we've got no logic. And what do I mean by logic? Let's just do this on the keyboard. Those are numbers. That's a valid number, and if I hit enter, it thinks I'm that old. So that's what we're going to learn in coming videos in future sections, is how to really determine if that's a valid number. If there's a human being walking this earth that's old, well, they've probably had a lot of birthdays. Let's just put it that way. Point being, C++ is very fast, but it's not very smart. You have to tell it what to do. Let's look at the C++ standard error. Now, if you've looked into C++ at all, or if you've taken another class, it may not be abundantly clear what a standard error is. Well, it's C++'s way of outputting an error or some sort of issue. It's our way of telling the outside world that, hey, we really didn't want this or expect this to happen. It's a problem. And it does that so that you can really differentiate between what you want to output to the user and what you want to output to, well, other systems that are going to read that standard error. It gets a little confusing, and unfortunately at our level of knowledge, it's not going to be that much clearer, but I at least want to cover it a little bit so you have a concept of what we're talking about. We're going to say include, and we want IO stream. From here, let's go ahead and let's do a C++ standard out. Now you notice two things right off the bat here. First, undeclared identifier cout. We have two options here. We can either do something like this, which will use the standard scope here, or we can do a using like we've done in the past. And notice how even now that we have this using namespace std, we don't really need this, but it's not throwing an error. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. So we have the standard out. We've seen that before. I'm just going to do the old copy and paste. Now, really what we're going to do here is we're going to take this and we're going to change it to C error. That's it. It's really that hard. Let's go ahead and run this and see what it looks like here. Now on the screen, this is why it's hard to really explain things to newbies here. You see how it's saying standard out, standard error. It looks identical. And let's go ahead and do an indel at each one of these just to really separate them here. Save and run again, and let's see what this looks like. They look identical. So for us mere mortals, standard error really isn't super helpful. This is meant for other programs to determine what is meant to be standard output and what is an error message. You know, something bad happened. You ever been running a program and like it pops up on the screen and says error? Well, that's pretty much what's going on here. Is it's saying, hey, we didn't really expect this. So in a kind of real world console application, your standard output might be in white or green, but the error message might be in red. That's really what we're doing here. So this video, we're going to talk about Qdebug versus cout. Now, the reason why is Qt provides a more organized way of outputting messages, and we're going to demonstrate how we can organize those messages. And on top of that, I want to mention, even though it's a bit more advanced than what this course is going to cover, I do cover it in the advanced course. You can use something called a QInstall message handler, and I'm going to cover that right at the end here. So let's go ahead and let's just drop in some includes. So I'm going to say include IO stream, and let's go ahead and include Qdebug. I'm going to go ahead and do a using namespace std. All right, so we're going to say int age equals 0. So we're going to initialize that variable. And we'll say qinfo, enter your age. Whoops, help if I was actually in there. So we're going to say enter your age. Notice we don't need an endl or anything like that. So what QInfo is doing is just putting out information. That's why it's called QInfo. And we're going to get that age from the user. Now we have some choices here. We can either put information out there or we can do something different. So I'm going to do some information first. So I'm going to say QInfo. And let's say you are, and we've covered this before, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about this little bit here. So we're going to say you are age, and let's go ahead and say years old. Go ahead and save and run this thing. This is not going to win us any awards. It's very simple code. So enter your age. I'm just going to say, I'll say, I need just a random number, 34. You are 34 years old. Again, not going to win us any science awards. The code is very simple, but that's the whole point of Q, is it does make it very, very simple, just to make that a little more readable. But what happens if we wanted to kind of emulate or do something a little bit different? And when I say emulate, we're going to emulate that IO stream where it did that C error. What if we didn't want a specific age, or they didn't even enter an actual age or something like that? We want to be able to display that information, but at the same time capture it later. So let's just dive through these. We talked about QInfo. Very simple, very easy to use. Now I'm just going to do the magic of copy and paste. Say Qdebug. And this is often a source of confusion because you see this right here, uppercase Q debug, lowercase q debug. What's the difference between here? So this is the actual include. We're including that code so that we can use it in our program. And here's the actual function Qdebug. Notice case sensitivity matters. So what is debug? Well, debug is for you, the developer, or other developers, so you can see what's going on under the hood. As your programs become more and more complex, you're going to want debug information. You're going to say, hey, the user entered an invalid age. We need to figure it out. It gets a little more complex than that as well. So for example, we can say like a Q critical. This would be like, hey, your system's about to die, something that you really want them to know and pay attention to. That would be like a critical message. Your disk is getting full, your network's down, something like that. And then we can actually do something like this and say Q fatal. And I'm going to do this one a little bit different just to show that you can put it inside the parentheses. We're going to intentionally crash this application. Now remember, when we do a normal app, the Qt core application enters an event loop right here in a.exec. This little call to exec enters a loop, which is why the console stays running. We're going to, well, crash this thing. Save run. And at this point in time, it may not be abundantly clear why we're doing this, but you notice how it's running, and I'm just going to say 54. And uh-oh, whenever you see this in C++ land, press enter to close this window. That means your program's pretty much gone bye-bye, and if you press enter, it disappears. That's how you know a console app is crashed usually. So let's step through these. We've got our Qt core application with a variable a. We're passing some information to it. So we're setting up the app, and then we're running. And at the very end of this, we want to enter an event loop. So let's comment this out just to demonstrate what it would look like had we not called Q fatal. And I'm just going to enter garbage just to show, hey, doesn't matter. See, just works. So all of these on the screen look the same. Here's a Qinfo, Qdebug, and Qcritical. But now we can organize the information in a manner that makes sense to us, the developer. We can say this is informational, this is a debug message, which really only a developer should care about, and critical, we want to let the user know, hey, you need to worry about this. And if we wanted to, we could say, hey, crash this application intentionally. And we'll talk about this in error handling later on in the course, but there are times where you want to throw an error and say, hey, we cannot continue with our application because of some condition. And that's what Q fatal will really allow you to do here, is just hard crash that bad boy. Save run, let's demonstrate this again. And I'm gonna enter a valid age, and we crash the app. So presentation-wise, this looks identical on the screen. It's really hard to figure out what's going on. So again, this is very, very advanced, but we can actually intercept those messages and capture them using what's called Qinstall message handler. And I put the link out here in case you're curious, but we really cover this in the advanced course later on. It's not part of this course. I'm just putting it here for completeness so you understand what's happening. So in the documentation, QMessageHandler, they actually give you some sample code here that installs a message handler that allows you to grab these messages in real time. And here's the actual code. As a beginner, this probably just looks like a bunch of gibberish, but when you're in the advanced course, it makes perfect sense. So really what's happening here is anytime your application fires off a Qinfo or debug or critical or fatal, we can actually capture that and say, what kind of message was it? A debug, info, warning. We really didn't cover warning. We can add that in super quick. Warning, and there it is. And let's just run that just for the sake of completeness here. You can see warning looks just like the rest of them. It's not like a big flashy thing. And then you can capture critical and fatal. And then you could do something like just print it out or put it out to a file or send it to the system log or whatever you wanted to do. There are ways of really doing that with cout, but they're much more complex. And to be brutally honest, in this course and in future course, we will be using the Qdebug way of doing it simply because there are times where I want to do this sort of capture in the background. And it makes it really easy to represent what's going on the screen. You can say, hey, this is informational, or I just want this as a debug, or it's a warning message. And you can even set the levels so you can display which ones you want.